What's up, everyone? Welcome to Dipped in Tone. I'm Rhett, and I'm flying solo today. We are without Zach. He is unfortunately feeling a little bit under the weather, which I was last week, so we've traded off. But we're going to soldier on. Today we've got Oz Noy on the show, which is really cool. I've never had the chance to talk to Oz before. We get into all things about his sound and his rig and how he developed the sound and using modulation and combining, jazz and blues and funk and everything. And it's a really cool conversation. And we're going to jump into it pretty quickly here because I'm not just going to sit and talk about myself without Zach. So before we get into it, a couple of quick plugs. First of all, thank you to our patrons. If you want to support the show, check out the link in the description box down below to join our Patreon. Take a look at the different tiers. We give access to the patron-only Discord server, so you can listen to episodes live while we're recording them. You can submit your rig to be dipped. And if you like what we do here, that's a great way to support Dipped in Tone. And we also want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, which is StewMac. You go to stewmac.com/dipped in tone. You'll get 10% off of your order. Link is also in the description for that. And it's cold here in Atlanta. We're going through a season change. It's finally feeling like fall, which means the humidity is dropping. In fact, in my room right now, it's currently 20% humidity. So it's already super dry. So it's time to take care of specifically your acoustic guitars, keep them hydrated, keep them in their cases. And you can find all that stuff that you need to take care of your guitars, acoustic, electric, everything. Your setup is probably going to change because of the season change. There's a lot of stuff that we have to do going from summer to fall to winter. And you can find all of the tools necessary to take care of that guitar maintenance stuff at StewMac. So thanks again to StewMac for sponsoring today's episode. StewMac.com/dipped in tone for 10% off of your order. This is a quick intro. So we're going to jump straight into the interview with Oz Noy. Oz, what's up, man? Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So sorry that we're unfortunately a man down this afternoon, but that's how these things go. I was sick last week, so I guess now it's Zach's turn to be sick, but
yeah.
We're here anyways. So thanks for joining us, man.
Sure.
So I want to talk to you about your sound today, because I think you have such a unique approach to your sound, especially coming from the jazz fusion background that you come from. There's not very many players out there that use modulation like you do, use fuzz like you do, use things like ring modulation like you do. So I guess to start off with, can you kind of take us through, you grew up in Tel Aviv, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you got into,
Tel Aviv,
and you got into playing there around 15. And from what I understand, it was kind of a more traditional jazz background, right?
Well, the way it started, I started playing at 10 and actually started with the Beatles,
Oh yeah.
So I was always playing rock and pop and jazz, or pop and jazz. I always did both since I started, really, because I don't know. I guess when you start learning guitar, the way to kind of learn more advanced stuff is more through jazz, So when I was 15, I was kind of semi-professional already, kind of professional actually, not semi. So I would play with a lot of I started to do recording session. I would and I would play with a lot of the pop artists there.
Right.
But in the same time, I was studying jazz. So I was doing a lot of jazz gigs. So my whole thing was just basically doing both pretty much till this day, really. But growing up was always both worlds at the same time. That's why probably I'm a little more aware of guitar sounds and tones, because, if you do studio work or you play pop or rock gigs, you have to be aware of that stuff. Where in jazz, at the time at least, I was growing up in the 80s, it started to be more popular for people to play with solid bodies, but it was still not really popular. Like jazz was like a hollow body guitar with that kind of dead sound.
Right. Right. So what drew you to both simultaneously, the pop and the jazz stuff?
I just did it. I loved both. I never had I remember as a kid, people would tell me, oh, you got to decide. And I was like, no, I don't have to decide. I just do whatever I like, It's more work, I guess, in some ways. But I don't know. At the time, just, I I was always playing pop and rock and stuff like that. So that was always kind of a thing that I like to do, especially in the 80s where all the shredders were around and that stuff was always fun. But the jazz thing was interesting because I wanted to improvise and play jazz. So when I discovered like Pep Metheny, like in the 80s, the Pep Metheny group, Still Live Talk in that record, or like Chick Corea's first Electric Band record, or Helen Holdsworth, I was like, wow, this is what I want to do. Or Schofield was doing Blue Matter. It's that era.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to do. And I tried and I realized that there's no chance I can do it because in order to do that, you have to really study jazz, you know? So then I found some teachers that got me to play traditional jazz. So that's pretty much the story. I was playing heavy metal in one hand. The other hand, I had a hollow body guitar and I was playing bebop, you know?
Did the two inform each other? Like, did you find yourself on your heavy metal, your pop gigs at the time, thinking about your jazz harmony?
No. I was able to somehow, I was able to kind of separate it. I never played heavy metal, but I like the heavy metal guitar shred thing, you know?
Yeah.
So I would put that into pop gigs. You know, there's YouTube videos of me playing with an Israeli artist when I have long hair and I'm tapping and stuff. And I was like 20 or something, or 18. So, but the jazz thing was always kind of separated. I think it started to all connect right before I moved to New York because I started to do some bar gigs where it started as a kind of a trio playing blues without a singer, so it was all instrumental. And then I got bored of that and I started to add some R&B tunes like Stevie Wonder and James Brown. And after a while, I was like, well, what would happen if I just start playing all my jazz vocabulary on that stuff? So that's how things kind of started to come together as one thing. And then when I moved to New York, it took a minute. Well, once I got rid of my hollow body guitar in New York, because I realized that it ain't gonna work great for me that with that tone, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that when that happened, then things start to kind of come together.
So in Israel in the 80s and 90s, what was the gear scene like? Like what kind of rig did you have? Was there was it easy to access pedals and amps, or was it kind of hard to come by?
Well, it was very popular to use an ADA or a Triaxis, Boogie Triaxis, and everything in stereo. It was that kind of period. So that went on for a while. I never got my Triaxis, Boogie Triaxis ever. I'm still dreaming of the day, you know. But I used ADA, you know, with speakers and stuff, like doing the stereo thing. And then I got into Stevie Ray Vaughan, and that changed everything. So when that happened, I was like, okay, I need a twin reverb. So I got it, like the best amp that I owned in Israel. I used to use Marshalls, but it was like 900. It was crappy ones, you know, with pedals. But then I got a twin reverb with, you know, remember the ones that had the red knobs?
Yeah.
You know? So I had one with black knobs.
What year would that have been? Like late 88?
94.
Okay.
So that was like the first real decent amp that I owned. And that I used that for maybe 2 years. Then I moved to New York. But that's when I started to get more of a blues tone, you know?
Yeah. So was that the one that had the JBLs in it with the chrome dust caps?
I don't remember. I think it just had regular Fender Eminence or whatever they used at the time. Actually, believe it or not, I shipped it to New York at some point, and my first solo album, Hot, the studio album, I used that amp. I used 2 twin reverbs.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you got into Stevie in the early 90s, I guess, or late 80s. And
late 80s,
so how did that affect because you're known for playing Strats and Tellys mostly now, right?
Yeah.
So was that a product of the Stevie Ray Vaughan stuff?
I think so, yeah. Pretty much, yeah.
So you would have gotten a Strat and a Tube Screamer and a Fender and just gone full Stevie.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. I think that's what it does to everybody, really, once you're on it. And also at the same time, you know, I was listening to Eric Johnson and stuff like that. So Eric was another guy because those tones are so great, you know?
Yeah. So when you moved to New York in the 90s, what was that like? Because obviously New York is kind of the epicenter, at least in North America, for the jazz scene.
Yeah.
So did you jump headfirst into the jazz stuff, or were you just taking any gigs you could get your hands on?
Well, I took everything I could get my hands on. what was interesting is when I moved to New York, I was hoping for something that wasn't really there in the beginning. Like, I always loved jazz. So, like let's say more, not straight ahead, but more acoustic jazz. So when I came to New York, I went to a couple of clubs and I was like shell shocked from it. I was like, wow, this is really the best there is. You know what I mean? So I was a little freaked out to even try, you know what I mean? Because I was playing jazz gigs, but when you go and see Brett Melda or Bill Stewart or those guys in front of you playing in a small club, or Brian Blade or Kurt Rosenwinkel, and at the time it was mid '90s, they already had their shit completely together, like they sounded like they sound today. You know what I mean? So when you see that, you're like, oh, okay, well, I gotta step back. So that was one part of it, that's why I stayed in New York all those years, because of that. But I grew up also on, the Jocko thing and Stern and Hiram Bullock, and a lot of R&B and blues and stuff. And when I moved here, I didn't find that in the beginning. I was like, well, I can't really find that stuff. So it took a while to find the pockets of the guys that played that kind of stuff. So that took a while.
So how long did it take you to kind of muster up the courage, I guess, to start getting into the New York scene? If you came in and were super, which I understand, like going to see Rosenwinkel or Brad Mehldau at your local, I mean, what were you going to, like Smalls and clubs like that? Yeah.
I think what I was doing more is I was going to the R&B and blues jams that at the time they were happening. So you go and you sit in and, you start to meet people. So I was immediately more drawn to the electric kind of stuff, the jazz scene, I never kind of got into it in that sense. Like I never got into the small scene, or that kind of stuff. Later in life, I got into the 55 bar scene. I don't know if you know, because that's where Stern played. That was a little more open kind of musically, and I've done a lot of stuff there, and that was kind of where I would more play my jazzier stuff,
Yeah. Yeah. And so getting back to the sound, where were you at that time? Were you pretty, because I see you're now with 3 pedal boards and you're using, 2 different rotaries and pretty impressive rig. Where were you in the mid to late 90s? Was it always that sort of complex, or did you kind of work your way up to it?
No, what happened in the mid 90s when I was still in Israel, it was just a few pedals, really. Like not a lot, like delay, overdrive, maybe a chorus of wah-wahs or stuff like that. I didn't really know much about it. The one thing that I really didn't know much about, like I would get a decent tone, but I wasn't really aware of how important the amp is and the volume of the amp that you play with. I wasn't aware that there's a sweet spot to a Marshall or a twin reverb, you know what I mean? And if you're not in the sweet spot, it's just not going to sound right. So that's stuff that I was aware later when I moved to New York. So when I moved to New York, I just had a few pedals, like literally, like I think I had an Ibanez digital delay, like with a modulation that I saw Satriani was using. There's a picture of the pedal on one of his records. And like a Tube Screamer, a TS-808, and actually TS-9, not even TS-808. And, like things like that, like a delay. Then the Line 6 green pedal came out. That was a revelation. That changed everything for me.
The DL4.
The DL4. Yeah. So what happened was I had a 70s deluxe reverb that was not great. I had a reissue twin reverb that I was doing most of my gigs with that was okay, like it had volume and clarity, but so that was going on for a while. And then once I started to do my trio, which kind of happened, I never wanted to be a solo artist or do records. I just wanted to play. So I had this music because I was playing that in Israel. I thought, let me do that and get noticed in the scene. So once I started to doing that, I started to write, and the whole thing with my pedal board evolved from my writing, meaning like I would write certain tunes and I would, suddenly I would use a reverse delay, and then I want the reverse delay to go to another delay. So then suddenly you need 2 DL4s, and then you want to have a looper on the side also. So you use 3 DL4s, which I use at certain points, and then the whole thing with the Leslie and the tremolo, it all came from just playing live all the time and writing music. So at some point I had a really, really big board because, the tunes and what I was writing leading to my first studio album, it was kind of, the music was kind of asking for it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I love your use of rotary. I feel like the Leslie sound from a guitar player's perspective is one of the most underrated things.
Yeah.
It adds so much, especially in a trio context where you kind of need to fill up a lot of the space.
Exactly. That's exactly what it was. It was because I played a trio, the effects became kind of almost another instrument. You know what I mean? It adds another color. It kind of makes it more interesting. And I used to do a lot of stuff for a minute with loops. Now I still do stuff with loops, but there was a period when when I did the second studio album, Schizophrenic, I used to do, if you listen to Schizophrenic, there's all these like really fast lines. It's stuff that I loop while I play and then I double time it and reverse it. So I used to do a lot of stuff in real time with loops. I still do. It just changed. So a lot of those things happened while I was playing live. Things just started to kind of pop up. Like the example that I always say was, I do this thing where the tremolo is really, it's a hard tremolo and it sounds like it's a rhythm part of a rhythm guitar. That happens as a mistake when I was in Japan, when I was doing my first tour. My feet hit the tremolo pedal and it went all the way up. And I remember playing a chord and go like, oh, what is this? But then I went with it and suddenly I realized that I'm playing rhythm and I edit in and out. It sounds like I'm doing you know what I mean? So it's like little things like that, but it all happened through live playing. I was kind of lucky because I play live all the time.
Yeah. So your approach to sound is when in terms of writing, I guess there's sort of two approaches where you have an idea of a sound in your head and you try and get it out of your amp, or you stumble onto something and that inspires a part. Are you kind of both in practice, or you do one or the other?
Both. To me, the most important thing is just something that you always struggle with, is just to get a really good basic tone. Everything else kind of come on top. If you don't get a really good basic tone, nothing else will really work. So I learned over the years, and I've changed a lot of different amps and stuff. But I started with twin reverbs in New York, and then I had Bandmasters that were modified. Those were pretty good, actually. And then after that, I had a Marshall for a long time. And then when the Turok came into my life, that kind of made a big difference, because Turok doesn't sound like a Marshall, but it has that kind of punch, So you get like that kind of Fender clarity and like an exotic kind of sound, but with a lot of balls, So that made a big difference. And also all those amps started to react well, where before, I was playing, I was like, why is the distortion so thin, or this sound doesn't have sustain? I wasn't realizing that you have to play in certain volumes and use certain amps and certain kind of levels to get, it's like air that's moving. Like I'm talking, the air moves. It's the same thing with a guitar. So that's the main thing. And that's something that you always struggle with that. Even if you have great amps, it's always like, whatever room you're in and wherever you're standing, it always has to, something has to give back. Otherwise it's really hard to play, really.
Yeah. What Turok are you using now?
I use either a TS1 or a classic reverb.
Yeah, I just recently
both.
I just got a classic reverb, the 100-watt recently.
Yeah,
and it changed my life because of like there's this just fidelity to it. There's just more coming from that circuit than most other amps I've played. Yeah.
The Turoks are really something else, I have old Fenders. If I do smaller gigs, I use an old deluxe. I have a Princeton. I used to have a super reverb that I liked, but I didn't find, the thing about using amps for me is if you don't have the right gig to use the amp, then you end up not using it. And I had a really nice super reverb in my house, and it was sitting in my closet for 2 years. And after 2 years, I was like, man, I haven't touched this in 2 years. I better not
Yeah.
keep it. So it's that kind of stuff. I have a really beautiful old Vox that I'm not using yet. And I have Marshalls. I have a 50-watt plexi and a 100-watt plexi. The 100-watt I record with at home all the time. The 50-watt I used to play with it live, but again, it's the same thing. You have to have the right gigs to use it on, otherwise it just doesn't sound right, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, you really have to be working those amps. Otherwise, they just kind of fall apart, you know?
Exactly, yeah. So a lot of the times I'll use deluxe. Sometimes I use 2 deluxes. That works great too, you know? So it kind of depends on the gig and on the room, really, at this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
So you use a lot of things like octave fuzz and ring modulation and things that are kind of out there for a lot of guitar players. I'm a huge octave fuzz fan myself. Yeah. Like one of my favorite things to do is, turn the guitar down to get sort of a pseudo ring modulation kind of sound. How did you get to that? What drew you to that stuff originally?
Well, I don't use ring modulator. I use something on the line 6 that sounds like it. I think it's called frequency something.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
It kind of does the same thing, I never had an actual ring modulation. If you use the Octavia the right way, it will sound like that a little bit. Years ago, a friend of mine brought a full tone octave fuzz, and as soon as I played it, I was like, oh my god! And I ran and bought one. I didn't even have the money. I just was like, oh, I gotta have this. So I've been using. That was in probably the late '90s or something. So I've been using Octavia and octave fuzz for a really long time, and there's so much character, there's so many sounds that you can get out of those pedals just by turning the volume of the guitar up and down. So I started to use it, and again, it was one of those things that it was very inspiring to me, and I use it on some of my tunes. On a lot of tunes of mine, it's like a part of the kind of vocabulary at this point of what I do. But again, it just happened because I plugged into one, I played 2 chords, and I ran and bought one. I was like, oh, I gotta have this, And actually, the song, the first studio album that I made, it's called Ha, and the title track is called Ha, and I wrote that because of the octave fuzz, because I bought the octave fuzz and I played with it at home, and I came up with this riff. Sometimes sounds can get you to play things and to get you to get stuff that you wouldn't normally go for,
Yeah. So what is your writing process like? Are you sitting at home and creating fully fleshed out demos, or are you just kind of putting an idea down and then getting in the studio with a rhythm section and cutting it live?
Well, first of all, I haven't done a studio album in a long time with original music. The last one I've done was right before the pandemic. But my process up till then, which was for many years actually, was I would first of all try to get a concept of what I want an album to sound, or what kind of style or what kind of direction I want. So for example, I did Twisted Blues Volume 1 and 2. So those records I had in mind all those blues forms, like shuffles, rumbas, all this different. And then I would put my own twist on it, like more modern jazz harmony and stuff like that. And then I did an album that's called Who Gives a Funk. So that was more I was really thinking about R&B kind of vibe and funk vibe. So I started listening to this music, and that kind of inspires me. The last 2 albums that I did were kind of Boogaloo inspired albums. So I listened to a lot of this kind of Boogaloo stuff. So that's the first thing. And then after that, I always collect ideas. I have always, if I have a guitar riff, a chord, a thing, I always record it. And then every once in a while, I'll listen to it. And once I listen to it, if it kind of grabs my attention, usually what I would do is I have Pro Tools here, so I would put it on Pro Tools. Normally, I would program a drum beat and a bass line. And then if that works for me, if it grooves or if it's got something, then I start developing it. And actually, all the tunes I would say that 90% of the tunes that I wrote, I basically write the bass lines and the idea of the drums at home. And then the drummers and bass players that come in, they make it their own and make it better. But the idea and the concept always comes from me, and it comes from just, I'm doing very, very basic Pro Tools demos, like super basic.
Yeah.
And then what we would do is we would go and do very short rehearsals. Like I'm talking about, I'll come with a tune, we go for half an hour in the room and go like, this is a tune. And then we play it live for a month, like for many months sometimes before I go in the studio. So then it gets developed and gets organic. And then once I have it together, then we go and record the album. That's most of the albums I've done were done like that. There's a few situations where I used guys from LA or something, like Vinny Colaiuta, Weckl, or even Dennis Chambers, that we did play live, but we didn't, let's say, play live as much as I would want it to be, but it was enough to go in the studio and do it.
Yeah. Probably saves you on some studio time too if you've spent all that time shedding the tunes on gigs.
Yeah, I don't believe in this kind of music. I don't believe in bringing a chart to somebody in the studio and playing it. I just don't believe in it. Even in the studio, when we go in and with all those guys that I play with that done gazillion records, it always takes a couple of takes, even after you know the tune, to get it right, you know?
Do you find yourself, like, as you're writing, do you have certain rhythm sections in mind for a specific tune?
Yes, absolutely. It's kind of more like, I think a lot about who's going to drum on it, you know, because drummers are the ones that really bring the sound of the band, you know?
Yeah. So like, what are you looking for out of a great, because you just worked with Dennis Chambers recently. So, you know, working with Dennis Chambers, Dave Weckl, or Vinny Colaiuta, like what are you looking for specifically with somebody like Dennis Chambers over Vinny Colaiuta? Or is it just, I know their sound and I know what they do well, and I'm going to pick something that fits their vibe? Any
of those guys, they all sound different, you know? So it's basically knowing, it's not only them, it's every drummer that I play with. I kind of know what they sound like, and I know, I have an idea of where I think they're going to, which tunes or what kind of vibes they're going to be really good at, you know what I mean? So, and you know, I toured with Weckl for many years, and I toured with Dennis now for a couple of years. So when you play with somebody a lot, you kind of really get to know what they do, you know? Yeah.
So when you go into the studio to record this stuff, are you just bringing in your live rig and using your standard amps and pedal boards? You're not using stuff from the studio or anything?
No.
So it's really just to go in and record. You've done all the work ahead of time. Like all the creative and production work is done, and you're just going in just to put it on tape, basically. Yeah. The only thing I've done in some of my last albums was I sent a direct signal out without I send I use two pedal boards. At least I used to. One had more like the overdrives and modulation. The other one is more delays and stuff and reverbs and stuff. So I would send a direct signal for an amp without the effects, just in case something records too wet. You know what I mean? Yeah. But I haven't actually had a problem. All the records I've done so far, the effects were right on. I'm not sure if I recorded with reverb or not. I think most of my recordings are recorded without reverb, but definitely delays. Right. Yeah, because you can always go back and add that in later. So getting back to reverb, actually sometimes make a mess when you record with reverb. Yeah. Especially I don't play with a lot of gain, but I play loud, so, you know, the amp kind of pushes, and sometimes if you have reverb, it can make a mess. Yeah. So you're using live amps primarily. Have you experimented or used any kind of digital modeling at all, or are you just kind of, that's not your thing? Well, at home, I have a setup where I have a couple of heads here. I have the TS1 Turok head. I have a 100-watt Plexi, and I have a twin reverb, an old twin reverb head, actually, believe it or not, like a blackface. So I have it set up where it goes to speakers, but it also goes to the aux, the universal audio aux. So, you know, it sounds, again, I think the speaker sounds a little better,
But the aux, certain sounds on the aux are great. So, that's as much as I've done in terms of direct recording. Anything else, I haven't found anything yet that works. I know there's some stuff. I tried, I don't know. I'm messing around with the quad cortex, but not enough to get it to a point where I'm using it,
Yeah. Yeah. If you're used to having the speakers or the cabinet in the room with you or on the stage with you, going to some kind of modeler is kind of tough.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So when did that transition happen for you? That realization of like understanding that the amp needs to be moving some air to really start to sound good. Was that a specific moment, or was it just when you kind of got to New York and started figuring it out?
What happened is I got really lucky in New York because when I moved here, it was in the mid 90s. There was still a lot of gigs here, a lot more than what there is now, and clubs and stuff. But there is a club that's still around and that I still play at. It's called the Bitter End. And I started to play there regularly. In the beginning, it was like once a month, and then it turned into be every Monday for 17 years, actually. So the thing that was great about this club, and it's one of the only ones in New York, if not the only one, is it's big enough that you can actually bring a Marshall or a big amp and open it up and play pretty loud,
Yeah.
So because I had this situation in this room, I was able to kind of play with amps and kind of see how they really react, like where if you play a small room and you can't open the amp, it doesn't really matter. You would never figure out what works and what not. With this room, so I was able to bring a Marshall, a Turok, a Twin, a Deluxe, all that stuff. And as I was developing my band and making records, I would, I guess, play louder and louder. But I was also realizing, okay, these amps work best on these volumes and that kind of, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the thing is, again, you have to have the right room to do it in, because if you play in a small room, you can't open a 100-watt amp, then you can't do that. You can't get that. So it happens in New York probably after when I started to do my trio regularly, it was like in the early 2000s sometimes.
Yeah.
I started to realize, okay, if I play this amp and this volume, then I have sustain and all the frequencies open up and all that kind of stuff,
So what do you do when you're on the road and you run into a situation where you're way too loud for your room? How do you get around that?
Well, the problem to being on the road is a lot of the times I have to play rental amps. So that's where it starts. So I've been through this whole trip of, which amp is the best to rent. And believe it or not, I landed on my conclusion was that getting 2 Fender Deluxe reverbs, black faces, reissues are the best solution for me.
Interesting.
And I tried like twin reverbs are hell. I used Voxes for a while. The problem with all this stuff is, first of all, you don't know what you're getting, and some amps are really inconsistent, and at least the Deluxe reverbs, the new one, they're very consistent, so you can kind of get the same sound out of them, mostly. And also, they're not too loud, so basically what happens now is if I play a room that I only need to use 1 Deluxe, then I can still open it up on 4 and 5, and it will react. But if it's a bigger room, then I'll add the second Deluxe, and then you get more volume and tone. So I found that's the best solution for me these days for touring.
So you're not using like a stereo rig or whatever. It's just one, and then if you need more air, you just fire up the second one.
Yep. I don't use anything in stereo, no. I have a setup where I do a little stereo, but not when I tour. So,
got it.
Yeah, it's challenging. I just finished this U.S. tour. We've done a bunch of shows, and some of them were rental. A lot of them were rental amps with the 2 Deluxes. And the stuff sounds good, but then whenever I can use my Turoks, I use it. I remember Dennis would go like, "Oh my God, what a difference!" And I was like, "I know." It's kind of depressing. You go like, "Oh my God, what?"
It matters, man. It all matters.
Oh my God.
I mean, do you find yourself like struggling through a specific on a night where maybe the amps aren't doing what you want it to do, and how do you handle that?
You just handle it. You got no choice. It gets frustrating sometimes. Like sometimes you can kind of get dark on it a little bit, but I think this tour. The last two tours I've done, or three tours I done, was the first ones that I actually was asking for the two deluxes. And even if the deluxe tones wasn't really like beautiful or exotic or really what you want, at least it reacts good. You know what I mean? Because I using like reissued twins. They to me they sound completely dead. You can't even play on them. For me, they don't move any air. So to me, it's more important to just that at least the amp will react. If the tone is not as beautiful as could be, I still get at least a reaction from the amp.
Yeah. Some
That's more
compression
important
or
to me. Yeah, exactly. That's more important to me than the color. At
right.
this point.
Interesting. Because
Yeah,
you're getting most of your color from your pedal board, right?
exactly. Yeah,
Got it.
yeah.
Man, that's so I want to talk about your sort of combination of, or your approach to playing, blending the jazz and the blues and the funk influence. You mentioned Stevie Ray Vaughan earlier. What were some other influences for you earlier on that helped you kind of bridge the two worlds together?
It's kind of the usual guys like Pat Metheny, John Scofield, Stern, Alan Holdsworth. But then there's all these traditional guys like Wes Montgomery, Jim Hall, Kenny Burrell, and more modern guys like Rosenwinkel, Kurt Rosenwinkel, people like that. And then the other side of it is the rock guys or the blues guys. So of course, Jeff Beck, Eric Johnson, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Scott Henderson, I would put kind of in the middle of it. I don't know how it all connected. I just always loved both, you know what I mean? And I listened to both. I would say that I like the blues rock sound on guitar better than the jazz sound.
Mm.
So I like a really beautiful Fender tone from Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan more than I like, I don't know, a Jim Hall tone out of a hollowbody guitar. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think the fact that I like those tones immediately kind of brings you to, kind of mix it together anyhow.
So what modern players are there out there today that are really piquing your interest? Who are you listening to? You mentioned Rosenwinkel, but who else?
There's plenty of guys. It's kind of endless now. I don't know. Jonathan Kreisberg, Mike Moreno, I don't know, Gilad Hexelman, Nir Felder. There's like so many of them. I'm like, it's probably 20 more that I don't even remember now. Those are more like the modern jazz guys,
Yeah.
I found, I don't know, some people will hate me for saying this, but I found that except of Joe Bonamassa and Derek Trucks, I found, again, there's a few more. I'm not saying there's no others, but I found that the blues rock scene kind of stayed, it didn't really develop since the 70s or 60s. Like, Stevie Ray Vaughan came and made a big impact. But since then, a lot of the people that play, to me, they sound like versions of Buddy Guy or Stevie Ray Vaughan. There's like nobody really that took it to the next level or invented something new, except maybe Eric Johnson at the time that took all of that,
Yeah.
There is the modern rock guys I really love, like Tosin Abasi and all those like modern rock guys. They're really, and Henson, what's his name?
Tim Henson.
Tim. Yeah, like those guys to me, and those guys to me are really taking the guitar to the next level. So I like that stuff. And of course, some of the Matteo Sassato is great, and the Italian guy that plays with the
Matteo Mancuso.
Yeah, Matteo. Yeah, those are great. So they're really pushing the envelope pretty far.
I agree. I love what guys like Tosin are doing. It seems to really just to be pushing the instrument forward to a new place.
Yeah.
I would add, like Marcus King and Gary Clark Jr. into the guys like Bonamassa who are, especially Marcus. I don't know if you've seen him play at all, but
he's great.
He's amazing.
Totally. Yeah. So, there's plenty of guys. There's so much good stuff now. It's gonna, hard to digest.
So what advice would you give some of the younger players out there that are listening who might want to kind of follow in your footsteps sonically, kind of blending the jazz and the blues and R&B and funk and rock worlds together?
I think today is not a problem anymore at all, because I think today most of what I hear, at least from the jazz scene that comes out of New York, it's already a huge blend of things, you know? Like even think about just Robert Glasper, like mixing all, you know, jazz and you know, like R&B and all that kind of stuff, and hip hop and stuff. So I think now the world is completely open to anything, which is a great thing. I think the only thing I do think is that whatever you do, if you end up blending stuff or you end up playing traditional whatever, I think the most important is to have your roots, like strong roots, meaning like you really want to know the blues and you really want to know some jazz, which is bebop, because if you don't have those together, it's not going to sound as strong, to my opinion, you know. So like the you know the roots and the innovators are still the same, like BB King, Freddie King, Albert King, Buddy Guy, Hendrix, you know. That stuff needs to be in your playing. The same way as if you want to play modern jazz, you can't really do it unless you know the language of Charlie Parker, Wes Montgomery, and all that kind of stuff, you know. Thelonious Monk, Bud Powell, you know.
Kind of have to know where you come from to know where you're going, kind of thing.
Yeah, kind of. Although I was very strict about it for many years, and now I kind of see it probably because of YouTube. I see guys that do it, and I don't know if they went that same way, you know, like that took the same road. So I don't know. That's what I know, you know.
That's solid advice, you know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people share that sentiment. Like you kind of have to study the masters and
yes.
Would you say that that's kind of how you develop your sound, your own sound, is by studying
100%.
them and not being able to sound like them?
Yes, 100%. And the most important advice that I will give anybody that plays today is you gotta go out of your house and play live. Because the whole thing with having a camera in front of your face and doing the 1 minute Instagram thing, it's very impressive. It's very cool. Some of the stuff is unbelievable, actually. But in a way, it's not reality. Like, because in order to be a working musician, you have to be able to hang in a musical environment socially and musically. You know what I mean? And none of that happens when you sit at home.
Yeah.
You know?
I can attest to that as someone who sits in front of a camera and plays guitar a lot and still plays with bands and people. It is a completely different thing playing by yourself to a camera versus playing with a band. Yes.
So that's I would say that's if there's one thing I would say that is important, is that at this point, you know.
Yeah. I mean, would you say if a player wants to get serious about jazz, is it New York still the place? Would you tell them to pack up and head to New York, or no?
I definitely think that it would be worth it to be here for a period to just experience it firsthand. You know what I mean? Like, because there's so many great players, like pretty much everywhere you go, it's really high level. You know what I mean? So, and you can see some of the greatest jazz players just kind of in front of you in a little room. You know, so I would say yes. You don't have to live in New York, but between that and maybe go to some of the jazz schools, you know, like either Berkeley or NYU or New School, all that stuff, because you got access to really, really good players, you know, that can really show you how it's done, you know?
That's interesting you say that instead of teachers, because it's, you know, especially going to jazz school, you have access to great teachers, but if you can see people actually out there doing it in the real world, that's probably a better.
You know, that I never went to university or anything like that. I kind of studied with a few private teachers, and then everything else I kind of grabbed by myself just from being in the streets of New York, really. But I would say it's great to have a really, really good teacher. It's amazing. I wish I had some monster guitar player that was my teacher growing up. But I think it's really important to be around the environment of like to see how it's done live. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And when you're in school, the one thing that's good being in a university is you meet a lot of players and you can play together, you know? And you meet a lot of teachers that are the guys that do it. So, you know, there's benefits to that I think are, you know, pretty significant.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Oz, thanks so much for joining us today, man. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure.
Well, that was interesting. If you haven't checked out any of Oz Noy's records, you absolutely should. We'll link to a few in the description and in the show notes. I love the way he uses modulation, and his approach to a lot of these effects is pretty unique, especially in his space. So yeah, huge thanks, Oz, for spending the afternoon with us here on Dipped in Tone. I do have a shill today, and actually it's something that Zach is loaning me. This is not mine. This is his, and he bought it and paid for it full price, I believe. But it is the Westerland preamp overdrive pedal. I forget the actual name of this. The One, I believe it is, or it's like I don't know. But this thing is kind of hot right now. They had a whole thing of, you know, I think partnering with Vince Gill, or they gave Vince Gill the first one, something like that. But essentially, this is a kind of all-in-one preamp overdrive tone shaping box. And last time I was up at Mythos HQ, I saw it and was like, man, is this worth the hype? Because there's a lot of people talking about him. At least there was a few months ago when I saw it. So Zach said, man, take it home, play with it for a little bit. I've been using it and I like it. It's really useful if you're the type of player that is spending a lot of time between different styles of amps. You know, like Oz was saying, if you're backlining a lot of stuff, you're playing Fenders, Voxes, Marshalls, you kind of don't know what you're going to get. Something like this is cool because it'll fit in front of just about whatever you're using, guitar and amp wise. It's got silicon or germanium clipping. It's got hard or soft clipping modes. And it's got a built-in boost as well. So they're not cheap, but they're well made. It sounds good, and it's really versatile. So, yeah, this should have been Zach's shill, but I've currently got it. Thanks to the patrons for supporting us. If you want to join our Patreon, link is in the description box down below. Don't forget, there you can get access to things like our patron-only Discord server, as well as access to live tapings of the shows whenever we're recording them. Link is in the description. If you like what we do here, you can support the show that way. And want to thank the sponsor of today's episode, which is StewMac. StewMac.com/dippedintone will get you 10% off of your order. And like I said, seasons are changing. It's that time of the year to start taking care of your guitars. They probably need a setup. They probably need to stay humidified. And any and everything you need for that purpose is available at StewMac. So yeah, hopefully the next episode will be back to normal, both Zach and I in good health and good spirits. And thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like and a comment down below. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, rate us and review us. It helps new people find the show. So thanks, everyone. We'll catch you on the next one.